disappeared for 5 days, and when I came back, my reflection wasn't mine. I woke up to a strange and unsettling feeling, as if something had been stolen from me in the dead of night. My mind was foggy, clouded by confusion, and when I opened my eyes, the world around me didn't seem quite right. The ceiling above me was unfamiliar, the walls a shade I didn't recognize. My body felt heavy, like it had been through some kind of struggle, but I couldn't remember anything that had happened. Where was I? How did I get here? The first thing that hit me was the silence. It wasn't the normal quiet I would experience in my own home at night, but an unnatural stillness, like the world had stopped moving altogether. There was no hum of distant traffic, no soft sounds of life beyond the walls. It was as if I had been cut off from everything I knew. I forced myself to sit up, my head pounding with each movement. My legs felt weak, and my hands shook as I reached out to steady myself. I glanced around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. I could see an old, faded armchair in the corner, a small table cluttered with unfamiliar objects, and a window covered by heavy curtains that blocked any hint of light from outside. There was a mirror on the far wall, and as I turned toward it, I instinctively felt the need to check my reflection, to see if I was still me. But when my gaze met the glass, something wasn't right. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The reflection staring back at me was mine, yet it wasn't. It was as though I was looking at a stranger. My face seemed distorted, altered in subtle ways that I couldn't quite put my finger on. There was a scar on my cheek that hadn't been there before. I ran my fingers across it, expecting it to be some sort of dream, but it was real, rough and jagged beneath my fingertips. My eyes, too, looked different, as if they carried the weight of an experience I didn't remember. Had I been in an autism accident? I shook my head, trying to clear the dizziness, but it didn't help. The more I looked at myself, the more I felt like I didn't belong in my own skin. The reflection seemed to mock me, a cruel reminder that something was wrong, something beyond just the physical. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. I needed answers, but I had no idea where to start. I stumbled out of the room, my legs still unsteady beneath me. The house, or whatever this place was, felt wrong, as if it were both too familiar and too foreign at the same time. I passed through an empty hallway and down a flight of stairs, each step creaking under my weight, until I found myself in a small kitchen. It was the same as the rest of the place, old, abandoned looking, with dust covering every surface. But as I scanned the room, my eyes landed on a calendar hanging crookedly on the wall. I walked closer, my mind struggling to piece everything together. But when I saw the date written on it, my heart stopped. 5 days. The date read 5 days later than the last time I remembered checking the calendar. But I couldn't recall what had happened in those 5 days. I tried, but the memories were scattered, fragmented like pieces of a shattered mirror. I couldn't recall the events that led me here, the faces I had seen, or the moments I had lived. It was like the past had been wiped away, replaced by this dark void of uncertainty. I grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter, steadying myself. I couldn't explain the feeling in my chest. It was an odd mix of fear, confusion, and something deeper, something more profound. It was as if I had been dropped into a world that was just a little off from the one I had left behind. A world where time didn't quite flow the way I remembered. I reached for my phone, hoping for some clue, some trace of the life I had left behind. But when I unlocked it, the screen blinked to life with a flurry of missed calls, messages, and notifications. The names on the screen should have been familiar, but they weren't. My mind struggled to connect the dots. Who were these people? And why did it feel like I didn't know them anymore? I scrolled through the messages, trying to piece together any kind of explanation. But all I found were fragments of conversations that made no sense. People asking where I had been, expressing concern about my disappearance. But I had no answers to give them. I barely recognized the names, let alone the context. The panic in my chest began to rise, making it hard to breathe. I needed to leave, to get out of this place and figure out what had happened to me. But as I made my way to the door, I stopped in my tracks. The sound of footsteps from outside the house echoed in the stillness, heavy and deliberate. I wasn't alone. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the doorknob, my heart racing in my chest. Who was out there? I opened the door slowly, hoping to get a glimpse of whoever was on the other side. But when I stepped out onto the porch, the world around me froze. The street was empty, not a single person in sight. But that wasn't what unsettled me the most. It was the way the air felt, too still, too quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but then it grew louder, clearer, until it felt like it was coming from all around me. The words were impossible to understand, just fragments and echoes, but they carried a strange sense of urgency. You're not supposed to be here. The chill that ran down my spine was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It wasn't just the cold, it was something more, something ancient, something that made me feel as if I were standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss that I couldn't understand. My pulse quickened. I had to get out of here. I turned and ran, not knowing where I was going, just desperate to escape whatever this was. But the more I ran, the more the world around me shifted. The buildings began to blur, their shapes distorting, and the streets seemed to stretch out endlessly, as if I were caught in some sort of loop. Then, as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. I stood in the middle of the street, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of the chaos that had just unfolded. My body trembled from the effort, but my mind was racing. What was happening? There were no answers, only more questions. And the more I searched for them, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. When I returned to my apartment, it was like stepping into a life that wasn't mine anymore. The door opened with a creak that echoed through the hallway, and I stepped inside, trying to get a sense of the familiar surroundings. But nothing felt familiar anymore. The scent in the air was wrong. The furniture, the decor, even the layout felt off, as though it had been rearranged, replaced with things I didn't remember. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, unable to shake the sensation that something wasn't right. I turned around, expecting to see the world I had left behind, but what I saw was nothing like I remembered. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the air felt thick, like it was suffocating me. I couldn't put it into words, But the world around me was different. I was different. I reached for my phone again, hoping to find something that would bring me back to reality. My fingers brushed against the smooth glass, and I unlocked it with shaky hands. The screen flashed to life, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe this time it would feel like everything was normal. But as I scrolled through the messages, the texts, the calls, nothing made sense. There were messages from my friends, from family, all of them with concerned tones, asking where I had been, why I hadn't answered. Some had even called the police, thinking something had happened to me. But what struck me the most was the date on everything. The dates that had passed since my disappearance. It was 5 days ago, just like the calendar had said. How could I have lost 5 days? I didn't remember anything from those 5 days. It was like they had been erased from my mind completely, replaced by a blank space I couldn't fill, no matter how hard I tried. I wasn't sure if I had even been alive during those days, or if I had existed in some other form. I walked through the apartment, touching objects that should have felt familiar, but instead they felt strange in my hands. There was an old clock on the wall, ticking away in its usual rhythm, but the sound grated on my nerves as if it was mocking me. I glanced at the reflection in the window, but for some reason it made my stomach twist. That's when I noticed it again, the scar on my face. It had been there before, but it had faded into my memory, like a bad dream. Now it stood out in the stark light of the apartment, a permanent mark I couldn't explain. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. I stood frozen, my heart skipping a beat. Who could be at the door? I hadn't seen anyone since my return, and the last thing I wanted was to face someone else when I couldn't even make sense of what was happening to me. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the door. It rang again, louder this time, almost like a command. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I walked over and opened the door, my breath catching in my throat when I saw the person standing outside. It was my best friend, Jason, standing there with a worried look on his face. His eyes searched mine, and I saw the confusion in them. He was looking at me like I was someone else, like he didn't recognize me. The way he stood there, unsure, made me feel even more out of place. "Where the hell have you been?" he asked, his voice shaky. "We thought you were gone for good, man." I didn't know how to answer him. I didn't know where I had been either. I don't know, I whispered, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. I woke up somewhere else. I don't remember anything after that. Jason stepped inside, looking around the apartment with a puzzled expression. "This place is different," he muttered under his breath. "Are you sure you're okay? You've been acting strange since you came back." I didn't know how to explain it to him. I wasn't sure I could explain it to myself. What was happening to me? I felt like I was walking through a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Jason's eyes kept shifting, like he was trying to figure something out. Finally, he sighed and looked back at me. "Maybe you should talk to someone. Maybe a doctor or a therapist. Something's not right, and you need to sort this out." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure what I could say. I didn't even know what had happened to me. How could I explain the feeling that something had shifted? That I wasn't in the same place I had left behind? As Jason left, I stood by the door, my mind racing. The world outside seemed so normal, yet it felt wrong. It felt like I was living in someone else's life, like I had been replaced by someone else. Was I even the same person anymore? That night, I couldn't sleep. The bed felt too soft, like it was swallowing me up. My mind kept replaying the events from earlier, trying to make sense of them, but nothing added up. It was like I had been in a completely different place, a place that didn't fit with what I knew of the world. I finally got up and went to the window, looking out into the dark street below. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The strange thing was that it wasn't just the outside world that felt different. It was the people around me. When I saw my friends, I felt like I was looking at them through a glass wall, separated by an invisible force that I couldn't break through. It wasn't just me. They had changed too. They looked at me with concern, but it was as if they were seeing a ghost, not the person they knew. That night, I had a dream, or at least I thought it was a dream. I stood in the same apartment, but everything was wrong. The furniture was arranged differently, the walls were a different color, and the air was thick with an eerie energy. A voice echoed from somewhere, deep and distant. "Don't trust them," the voice whispered. "You're not who you think you are." I woke up with a start, my body drenched in sweat. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Everything was too quiet, too still. The feeling of unease clung to me like a shadow. I had to know what had happened, had to understand the gap in my memory. But the more I searched for answers, the more elusive they became. Was I still the same person? It was the third night after I came back, and the weight of everything was starting to sink in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that I was somehow disconnected from the life I had left behind. The scar on my face, the odd memories, the strange dreams, they all pointed to something deeper, something I couldn't explain. But as the days went on, I started to feel like I wasn't alone in this. There was a presence lurking just beyond the edge of my awareness. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, pressing against my consciousness like a shadow in the corner of my eye. It was the middle of the night when it happened. I had been lying awake in bed, my mind racing, when I felt a sudden chill sweep over me. The temperature in the room dropped so quickly that I could see my breath in the air, like I was standing in a freezer. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I tried to turn on the light, it flickered and died. What the hell is going on? I could hear the sound of soft footsteps in the distance, but when I strained my ears, I realized they weren't coming from outside my room. They were coming from inside, right behind me. I spun around, my heart thudding in my throat, but the room was empty. There was no one there. The silence that followed was almost worse than the footsteps themselves. I felt like I was being watched, and every instinct inside me told me to get out of that room, to run far away from whatever was happening. But then a voice spoke. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, and it felt like it was coming from all around me. "You're not done yet." The words sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but they felt like a command, like a warning. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but my throat felt tight, like I couldn't find my voice. The room seemed to shift. the walls warping around me, and suddenly I was no longer in my apartment. I was somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't place. But the air felt thick and heavy. The ground beneath me was cold, almost metallic, and there was a strange hum in the air, like the sound of electricity. I looked around, but the space I was in was vast and dark, the edges of the room stretching out into infinity. And then she saw them. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but as I focused, the figures became clearer. They were standing in the distance, watching me, their faces obscured by shadows. They weren't human, not in the way I understood. Their forms were fluid, shifting like smoke, their eyes glowing with an intensity I couldn't comprehend. Wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I were paralyzed, held in place by some unseen force. The air around me grew heavier, and the figures began to move closer. They didn't speak, but I could feel their presence pressing against me, suffocating me, until I thought I might collapse under the weight of it. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the vision changed. The figures were gone, and I was back in my room, lying in my bed. But everything felt different. I wasn't sure if I had dreamed it, or if it had been real. The feeling of presence was still there, lingering in the back of my mind, and the coldness in the room hadn't gone away. I sat up, gasping for air, my heart racing. My body was drenched in sweat, and I felt a sense of panic rising in my chest. What had I just experienced? Had I really seen those figures? Had I truly crossed over to some other place? I stumbled out of bed, feeling disoriented. The world around me seemed different, more distant, like I was seeing it through a fog. I couldn't tell if it was the aftermath of the dream, or if something had changed in me while I was gone. I rushed to the mirror again, needing to see myself, needing to confirm that I was still me. But when I looked into the glass, I saw the same face, the same scar, the same eyes, yet they seemed different. There was something in them, something dark, something that hadn't been there before. It was like I was looking at someone else, someone who had returned from the dead, someone who didn't quite belong in the world they had come back to. I stumbled back, my mind spinning. What had happened to me? Where had I gone? What was it that I had seen, and why did it feel like I was no longer in the same reality? The questions burned in my mind, but no answers came. I couldn't escape the feeling that I had crossed a line, that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see. The scar on my face was a reminder of that moment, a physical mark of whatever had happened to me. But it was more than just that. The scar was a sign, a symbol of the experience I had gone through, of the fact that I had been touched by something beyond the physical world. I needed to understand what had happened, needed to find the truth. But the more I tried to piece it together, the more fragmented the memories became. I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind, or if something else was at play, something far greater than I could comprehend. But one thing was certain. I wasn't the same person who had disappeared 5 days ago. I had changed. And whatever had happened to me, whatever I had seen, was something I couldn't ignore. I had been given a glimpse of something far beyond my understanding, and I didn't know if I would ever be the same again. The days following my strange encounter were a blur. I tried to focus, to get back to some semblance of normalcy, but every step I took seemed to pull me further away from the life I had known, the scar on my face, the strange symbols that I kept seeing in my mind, the coldness that lingered in the air around me. Everything felt off. It was as though reality itself had fractured, leaving me in a version of the world that didn't quite fit. I tried to reach out to my friends, hoping that they would offer some comfort or explanation. But when I spoke to them, it was like I was speaking to strangers. They recognized my face, my name, but there was an underlying disconnect, something that I couldn't explain. It was subtle at first, an odd glance, a hesitation in their words. But as time went on, it became more pronounced. Jason, the closest person to me, was the first to notice the change. He looked at me differently, like I was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "You okay?" he asked one day, his voice tinged with concern. "You've been acting distant, man." I couldn't find the words to explain. How could I tell him that everything felt different, that the world I had returned to didn't feel like the one I had left behind? How could I explain that? Even the simplest of things, like the way the sun hit the sidewalk or the taste of my morning coffee, felt wrong. "I'm fine," I said, though it felt like a lie even as I spoke it. "Just tired." "It's been a lot to process." Jason nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe me, not completely, and I couldn't blame him. I didn't believe me either. The more I tried to piece together my memories, the more I realized that they didn't line up. Events I thought I remembered clearly started to blur together, as though they had been rewritten in some way. I thought back to the conversations I had with people before I disappeared, but the words seemed hollow, as if they had come from someone else's mouth. I even began to question the very fabric of time itself. It wasn't just the 5 days I had lost, it was everything. The days that followed my return didn't feel like the same days I had left behind. They were different. I could feel it in my bones, in the way time seemed to stretch and bend in ways I couldn't explain. It was as if I had stepped into a parallel reality, one where things were similar but not quite the same. There were small, almost imperceptible changes, like the way my mother's voice sounded on the phone. She was still the same person, but there was something off about her tone, as if she was reading from a script rather than speaking from the heart. And then there were the details that didn't add up, the photographs that seemed to have changed, the memories that no longer felt like my own. One night I decided to confront the feeling head-on. I went through my entire apartment, looking for anything that might explain the strange sense of displacement. As I rifled through old boxes of belongings, I found something that sent a shockwave through my body. It was a letter, folded neatly in a drawer I hadn't touched in years. I recognized the handwriting. It was mine, but not quite. The letters were different. The style was off, as if someone else had written them in my hand. I opened the letter slowly, my hands trembling. The words inside were brief, but they chilled me to the core. "Don't trust anyone. Everything you know is a lie. The world has changed." What was this? I couldn't explain it. It didn't make sense. How could I have written this? And why had I hidden it away? More importantly, why was I only finding it now? I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the letter, my mind racing. It was like a door had opened, revealing something that I wasn't prepared to face. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't the only one who had changed. The world around me had shifted too. I had returned from my disappearance, but I had come back to a different place, a different version of reality. I decided to confront Jason again. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. When I called him, he answered immediately, but his voice sounded different too, distant, almost like he was talking to me through a thick veil. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling. "I need to talk to you about something. Something's not right." There was a pause on the other end, and when he spoke, his voice sounded cautious, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "What do you mean? You've been acting strange lately. You're not the same." I shook my head, frustration bubbling up. "I know. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Something's wrong with everything, with us. The way we talk, the way things feel. It's like everything's been changed, and I don't know why." Jason was silent for a long time, and I could hear him breathing on the other end. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe, it's not just you, man. Maybe we're all in the wrong place. Maybe something happened, and we don't even realize it." I didn't know what to say. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was he right? Was the world I had come back to not even the right one? But before I could respond, the line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening, and I felt like I was falling into something dark and unknown. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't wake up from it. I was caught in a reality that wasn't mine, a reality that was slipping further and further out of my control. The days blurred into one another as I continued to search for answers, but with each passing hour, the world around me seemed to grow more distorted, more incomprehensible. I had no idea how to explain it to anyone, least of all to myself. I had tried reaching out to Jason, but it felt like we were both caught in a web of confusion, unable to untangle the threads of reality. It wasn't until I received the call that things took a darker turn. The phone rang in the middle of the night, its shrill tone cutting through the silence that had settled in my apartment like a thick fog. I picked it up on the first ring, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I asked, my voice shaky. It felt like I was still trapped in a dream, unable to wake up. Is this really you?" The voice on the other end was distorted, like it was coming from far away. But I knew it immediately. It was Jason. "Of course it's me," I replied, my frustration rising. "Who else would it be?" There was a long pause before Jason spoke again. No, you're not. Something's wrong. Something happened to you. Something that's changed everything." I felt a chill run down my spine. His words hit me harder than anything else had. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You've been acting different," he said, his tone trembling. "I don't know how to explain it, but I've been seeing things that don't add up. The memories we have, the things we've talked about, it's like they're not real anymore. It's like we're living in some sort of alternate reality." His words mirrored everything I had been feeling, everything I had been experiencing since I woke up in that strange place. It was as if the universe itself had been altered, and none of us could understand what had happened. "I know," I whispered. "I know. That's exactly how I've been feeling. Like something has shifted, but I can't figure out what." There was another long pause before Jason spoke again. "Listen, I need you to meet me. There's something I found, something I can't explain. You need to see it for yourself." I agreed without hesitation, though I had no idea what he was talking about. All I knew was that I couldn't keep running from this. I had to confront whatever had happened, even if I wasn't ready to face the truth. I met Jason at a cafe the next morning. He was sitting at a corner table, staring down at his hands, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. When I walked in, he looked up, his eyes wide with something I couldn't place. Fear, confusion, or maybe both. "You okay?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Jason didn't respond right away. Instead, he slid a folder across the table, its edges worn and frayed. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. Whatever was inside that folder was something that would change everything. I opened it slowly, the anticipation rising in my chest. Inside were photographs, old ones, some of them barely recognizable. At first, I thought they were just regular pictures, but as I examined them more closely, I saw something that made my stomach twist. The photographs were of us, Jason and me, taken in places we had been to together. But the faces in the photos, they weren't right. In some, I was smiling, but my expression seemed forced, unnatural. In others, I wasn't even there at all. It was like I had been erased from the memories, replaced by someone else. "Where did you find these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason leaned forward, his eyes filled with unease. "I don't know. I started looking through some old stuff, trying to make sense of everything. And then I found these. I don't know what it means, but something's wrong. These photos, they don't add up. They're from moments we've shared, but they're not real. The people in them aren't us." I felt my heart racing in my chest as I looked at the photos again. There was one in particular that caught my attention. It was a picture of me standing in front of my old house, smiling at the camera. But the house behind me, it was different. The windows were in the wrong places. The door was a different color. The entire building looked altered, like a distorted version of the one I had known. "It's like we're in a version of reality that doesn't belong to us," Jason said, his voice shaking, "like we've been pulled into a world that isn't ours." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been feeling the same thing, but hearing him say it aloud made it real. The world I had come back to wasn't the same world I had left behind. Time had been warped, and reality itself seemed to be crumbling around us. I looked up at Jason, my hands trembling as I held the photos. "What are we supposed to do? How do we fix this?" Jason shook his head, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know, but we have to find out what happened. We have to figure out where we went wrong and how to get back." There was a pause, and then he spoke again, his voice lower this time. "I don't think we're the only ones who've been affected. I think something or someone has been messing with us. And I don't know if we can trust anyone anymore." The weight of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and for the first time since my return, I felt a sense of dread creep over me. What had happened to us? What had changed everything? I didn't know the answers, but I knew one thing. I wasn't alone in this anymore. Jason was with me, and together we would find out what had happened. We would uncover the truth, no matter how dark it was. As Jason and I walked through the empty streets that evening, a sense of dread hung in the air. Every step felt heavier than the last, like we were walking through a fog that we couldn't shake. The world around us seemed to stretch out endlessly, and the familiar cityscape looked unfamiliar, distorted by the ever-growing uncertainty. We had decided to take the photos to an expert, someone who could help us make sense of the strange inconsistencies. Jason had been quiet for most of the walk, and I knew he was just as lost as I was. We both felt like we were drifting through an alternate reality, unable to find our footing. It was as if someone was watching us from the shadows, pulling the strings and twisting our lives into a shape that no longer made sense. The man we were meeting was a former investigator who specialized in unusual cases, unexplained disappearances, time anomalies, things that seemed beyond explanation. He had heard of us, had heard about what happened when I went missing, and now we were desperate for his help. When we arrived at his office, the first thing that hit me was the strange silence that filled the room. It was a small, dimly lit space with bookshelves lining the walls, filled with old case files and documents. He sat behind a desk, looking up from a set of papers when we entered. There was a strange intensity to his gaze, as if he had seen more than he was letting on. "You're here because you've been affected by something that goes beyond time and space, aren't you?" he asked without greeting us. His voice was calm, but carried an air of knowing. Jason and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Yes," I answered, my voice uncertain. "We don't know what's happening. We've been living in a version of reality that's not yours." The investigator finished for me. "I know. You've been through something no one could understand, and it's changed the fabric of your world." I froze, the words hitting me harder than I expected. "What do you mean? How do you know?" The investigator leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Because this isn't the first time it's happened. There are others, people who've vanished, only to return with the same stories. Some say they've traveled through time. Others believe they've crossed into alternate realities. But in the end, they all share one thing in common." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What is it?" "They all come back, different, changed in ways they can't explain." Jason stepped forward, his voice tinged with desperation. "What does that mean for us? Are we stuck in this other world? How do we get back?" The investigator's eyes darkened and he stood up, walking to the window. "I can't say for certain, but I can tell you this. Some things are meant to be broken. Some timelines, some versions of reality can't be fixed. The damage is too deep." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. The words were too heavy, too final. "So, we're stuck here." The investigator turned back to face us, his expression unreadable. "Not necessarily, but the truth you're seeking, it's not something you can just find. It's something you have to accept. Whatever you experienced, whatever reality you were in before, it's no longer yours. You're part of something else now." We left his office with more questions than answers. The weight of his words clung to me like a shadow, following me as we walked through the streets. The city felt different now, empty and cold, as if it had become a reflection of the uncertainty in my own mind. As Jason and I stood in the middle of the street, I felt like I was staring into the void, unsure of where I belonged. I had been gone for 5 days, but it felt like I had lost so much more. I had crossed over into a world that wasn't mine, a world that had been altered in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. And yet, there was something familiar about it too. I had the scar, the memories of my disappearance, the strange images that haunted me. They were pieces of the puzzle, but I wasn't sure how they fit together. I wasn't sure if I ever would, but as I looked at Jason, I knew that he and I were in this together. Whatever had happened to us, whatever had torn our reality apart, we would face it together. And maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back, if there was a way back at all. But as I walked away from him, a voice whispered through my mind, the voice from my near-death experience, the one that had told me, "You're not done yet." Maybe the truth was closer than I thought. Maybe the answers I was seeking were right in front of me, hidden in plain sight. But as the sun set behind the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was only just beginning to understand the cost of what had happened. The world had changed, and so had I. And no matter how hard I tried, I wasn't sure if I would ever truly belong to the life I once knew.